Welcome to everybody, both here and in person and online. It's a great pleasure to be back after a nice break. I'm Michael Mosser. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Disinformation Lab here at the University of Texas at Austin. It's wonderful to see so many of you here as we shift a bit from the conceptual treatments of mis and disinformation to what we could call the applied portion of today's program. We've had a great day already, right? We started the day with an impassioned opening speech by Ambassador Makarova, recognizing the importance of journalism and civil society in countering Russian disinformation in Ukraine, but also exhorting us to be ever on guard against new forms of disinformation. Our morning and early afternoon panels brought us experts on historical understandings of the role of information in public diplomacy, the impact of global media and technopolitics, impacts of information on digital repression and geopolitics. It's truly been Disinformation Day here at Connections. Each of our guest speakers has been exceptional, so let's give them all a big round of applause and a big thank you. It's also time, once again, to thank our sponsors. You heard me do this at the very beginning. I'm going to do it again. I would like to thank Texas Global, the Office of the Vice President for Research here at UT, and the Intelligence Studies Project for helping to sponsor today's event, and in fact, the entire Connections Conference. But I would like to give an especial thanks and an especial shout out to two people in particular. Michelle Daniel, our Connections Conference doyen, and also Sally Dixon, lab manager of the Global Disinformation Lab, and one of those without whom I literally would not be standing here. So thank you both. Great work so far, and great work to come. I would like to give you a little information about what's coming next, without stealing the thunder of the three people sitting to my right, to your left, in front of you, here on stage. These speakers you're going to hear from in a few minutes. And I expect you're going to be dazzled by everything that they have to say. But I'm here to tell you about the Global Disinformation Lab, GDIL. Now, you can read about GDIL on pages 28 and 29 of your program, so I'm not going to read it to you. But I want to give you a bit of the GDIL narrative of how we got to where we are today. GDIL started 3 years ago in the minds of two brilliant scholars, one of whom in the front row, Dr. Kirill Avramov, and one of them here on the stage, PhD candidate Ryan Williams, who both wanted to get beyond the headlines covering Russian targeted killing in a systematic and academically rigorous way. With the generous support of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Eurasian Studies, thank you, Mary Newberger, Director, as well as from the College of Liberal Arts, GDIL was born. The Targeted Killing Project became Project Bear Claws, the first of what are now 8 freestanding projects, 3 of which you'll hear about in a few minutes. GDIL was built to fulfill multiple functions: harness UT faculty and student interest, skills, and passions, incubate and promote interdisciplinary research, generate policy recommendations and new tools for combating global disinformation, train the next generation of disinformation researchers and policymakers, and respond in real time to global crises, each of which GDIL has done pretty remarkably. GDIL is organized in a format expressly designed to develop and empower student researchers. We have student-led projects, we have research skills workshops, and we have a dedicated student opportunities channel. As you can see, students are at the heart of everything that we do, and we're very proud of that fact. GDIL is also focused on projects that build on our multidisciplinary strengths. We have external project clients, we have an uncommon integration of quantitative and qualitative approaches, and we have a strategic approach to developing capabilities. Finally, GDIL is motivated by our impact and our partnerships. For us, public scholarship is a priority for every project. And we work very hard to generate significant interest from policymakers, industry, and other research units on campus. Again, I can say that we have been remarkably successful in all of those endeavors. That's a tiny bit of our story. We're happy to tell you more in the upstairs session here in an hour. But I can tell you, I will leave you with this. We have come a long way in the last 3 years. In 3 years, GDOL went from 1 project to 8, with 3 projects successfully concluded and archived on the GDOL site. In 3 years, GDOL's project map expanded beyond Central Europe to Asia, to North America, and beyond. And in 3 years, GDOL went from less than 10 students in a classroom setting to over 100 students at all levels, actively participating and even leading research teams. 3 of those students sit here before you. They are, in order, from my right to your left, right? Zach Daum, a mathematics honors major in the College of Natural Sciences. Liz Wong, a Master of Global Policy Studies student at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And Ryan Williams, a PhD candidate at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. These students, and all the students, are why we're here. The research they're doing is world-class, and it's getting noticed in places far beyond the 40 acres. Listen to these presentations, visit the poster session upstairs, and be prepared to be amazed. Disinformation is global, and so are we. Please, give it up for our guest speakers today, and thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Is it working? Now is it working? Okay, there we go. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We are Project Hairline. Project Hairline was started by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and contracts with universities, private groups, think tanks, such as the Global Disinformation Lab here, to provide critical intelligence to not only NGA, but our allies and the public as well. We have a couple key missions that are very much connected to the mission of the lab. First and foremost, since NGA is our client, is to provide accurate and most important, and on top of that, timely intelligence to NGA, the allies who depend on our intelligence, as well as the general public. This also relates to a key mission of Project Hairline, which is to increase trust between the intelligence community and the public, which is enhanced through this public publication of our intelligence. Second is to remain true to the mission of our lab and publish geospatial intelligence that is used to combat disinformation, which you will see some examples of our past research in a minute. And additionally, since we are a project largely of undergraduate students, we are tasked with educating members of our team in GeoInt and geospatial intelligence and open source intelligence techniques, which prepare them for careers in the intelligence community, as well as any other careers that can utilize skills of analytical tradecraft, analytical writing, among various other skills that we learn along the way. We integrate a number of techniques in our publications. This started off with Maxar imagery, which is provided to us by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and has since extended to various other data sources, from geospatial intelligence that includes lower resolution imagery that we might get more often, to open source intelligence on platforms like Twitter, Telegram, or databases that are made publicly online and we have access to. Our very first project started in the spring of 2022 and was called Trust But Verify. This started just as the Ukraine war began, and we generally stay shy of major conflict events. However, we felt that the humanitarian crisis that was being faced was of critical importance. So we began looking at refugee movements out of Ukraine and into Russia and surrounding countries, particularly around the context of Russian disinformation. We came to the conclusion that Russian state-backed media sources were substantially exaggerating the number of refugees that were entering Russia, likely in an attempt to bolster support for the war at home. As an example of the kind of imagery that we look at, we can see the Ukrainian border with Poland on the left a few days after the war has started, and it's pretty much packed. On the other hand, the Russian border with Ukraine, we saw some people trickling in, but nothing to substantiate the millions and millions of Ukrainians that the Russian government had been claiming had been entering Russia. After that project concluded, we turned to our next project, continuing to focus on the war in Ukraine, and looked at the Russian filtration system that had been alleged to be perpetrating humanitarian atrocities against Ukrainians entering Russia from Ukraine. We came to the conclusion that Russia was relocating these filtration sites on a regular basis in anticipation of where they expected fighting to come next. Now, this has two key pieces of significance. One is militarily. It's very, very important for us to know, where does Russia expect to be fighting next? If that doesn't match up with what we expect, that tells us something. On the other hand, there's a humanitarian angle. We want to know where these people are. If there are atrocities going on, we need to know where they're happening, when they're happening, and when and where they're going to be happening next so that we can work to prevent them. As an example, we can see this M2, the filtration site just within Russia, north of the Ukrainian city of Kherson. Shortly before the war, this was just a regular highway intersection. But after the war, the Russian government and military had set up a small filtration site at this location that was used to filter Ukrainian citizens fleeing conflict and basically separate them into people who they felt were a threat, who were detained and abused by the Russian government, and those who the Russian government deemed friendly were allowed to enter Russia, but often were still subjected to harsh treatment. A key point in this project was we were able to expand our technical abilities, which is something that we continue to do in our future projects. One of the most important things we did in this project was incorporating Sentinel imagery on top of the Maxar imagery that we've used in the past. On top of that, we incorporated local media reports that could give us a better picture of what was happening on the ground on a more granular level that we might not be able to see through the lens of a satellite, as well as other OSINT sources like what people were reporting on Telegram, which we could then go back and confirm using our satellite imagery. This really helps take our analysis to the next level and instills a greater degree of confidence as it allows us to have a greater number of confirmations of what we expect to see, what we are seeing, and what we expect to see next. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any other questions, ideas, or anything you'd like to ask us about Project Terraline, our current projects, past projects, what we might do in the future, please stop by our table afterwards.
Good afternoon. My name is Liz Wong, and I am the task team leader for Team BARN-OWL. BARN-OWL stands for Behavioral Analysis of Related Networks of Open Web Links. We would like to thank Ryan Williams for that title. It's been wonderful for us. A bit of a mouthful, but I usually get the applause, so I want him to get it this time. But we work in conjunction with not only the Global Disinformation Lab, but also applied research labs over on Pickles Research Campus. And then we've been mentored and supported by the Brumley Fellowship with the Strauss Center, as well as ISP, the Intelligence Studies Project as well. So I definitely want to get all my thank yous before I start my presentation. But I want you to start by thinking about where was the first time that you heard and you knew that there was a microchip in a vaccine? Or perhaps that there was a child trafficking ring under a pizzeria. We laugh, but I had to look at that for months. Or even that there was a coup happening in China. All right? Where did you hear that? Did you hear it from an aunt, from an old teacher, from a best friend? If so, where did they hear that from? Okay? I would take a bet that you did not think, hey, the United States came up with this vaccine very quickly. Okay. They also love to track us. Okay. How do they track us? They use microchips. Fine. Who pays for that? Is that Elon Musk? No. Doesn't make sense. He's too busy with SpaceX. It's got to be Bill Gates. I would bet no one in this room went through that logic order and was able to come up with the Google phrase, did Bill Gates put microchips in vaccines? It had to be marketed to you. That is the entire idea behind BARN-OWL, is that successful, in this term, successful just means It's at the top of content. You know about it. There's a lot that's buried. Successful disinformation has to be marketed. It has to be presented to you, and they have to use tactics that are abnormal to normal news sources because you are not going to naturally Google it or know to look for it like you would for a normal news source. So if you go in with this idea, bar now we work with domains, we don't work with social media. The reason being that we believe that we can prove intent better this way. So this is something like, you have to write the article yourself. You're not just resharing or reposting. We also work with SEO data, which means that we're looking at search engine optimization data, aka how do you get to the top of Google. And this data is important because according to a popular marketing agency called Backlinko, their 2023 status said that 0.63% of people go to the second page of Google. So what is happening to all that disinformation that isn't getting to the front page of your search results? It's probably getting lost, and people are probably wasting money, and people hate doing that. So we use these metrics for how things rise in SEO in order to study and mathematically prove that disinformation or coordinated amplification happens. And the key with bar now is that we do this without looking at content. We only look at backlinks. We don't care if we're talking about trains or balloons this week. We really are just looking at who is linking to who and how can you mathematically prove that it's abnormal in its coordinated amplification. Google also hates this. Google wants you to pay for AdSense. They want you to pay for ads. The last thing they want you to do is get around with your buddies and say, hey, we all work for Jito. Let's link to each other. This will be great. We rise up in the search engine. Bada bing, bada boom. Everyone knows about us. No, they want your money. So they also think this is bad. This is why we call it black hat. In marketing, it's called black hat marketing. So we're not as cool as the hackers. We don't do anything secretive, but it's still illegal to do. So we look at SEO. We believe this is a rich treasure trove of data that's untapped because marketing companies have already invested the money for us. They built the crawlers. They collected the data. There's over 200 signals that can be mathematically crunched or not. If you want to do NLP, you could also do keywords, content, etc. if you're into that stuff. But it's all open source. It's rich. It's very dense. And we believe it's a wonderful way to continue studying and look at translinguistic properties according to structural behavior on the internet. So our goal is to identify and empirically test methods for using SEO metrics to identify ongoing state-sponsored disinformation campaigns. Woo, that's it. So this slide I'd like to thank Dr. Kirill Abramov for. We're looking at how these states might be using websites. What might we be looking for when I tell my team, hey, every single week I want 10 sites in both English and your other language. All my student researchers are bilingual. So we're looking for a state-sponsored website. We're looking for a public-private mix, and we're also looking for just private, because you can make a ton of money and people will do it. They love it. So for the state media, you might tell people that you're Russia Today. You're like, we are Russian propaganda, we are Russian news. People say, great, that sounds like real news to me, let's do it. There's also state-sponsored think tanks, state-sponsored research journals, and state-sponsored 501(c)s that add credibility through that leverage of authority. Then there's the corporate-owned groups that will all be linking together, and there's individual-owned. And all of these have in common that they will rise in SEO ranks, not through the truth and not through you looking to them, but through each other linking to one another. So they have to form networks. So we use a Jacquard Similarity Index, which if you're into data science, you know is very basic. But the reason we start with the basic is to show how simple it could be, to show that link structure works for identifying coordinated amplification. We look at Jacquard similarity as well, because if you are a misinformation site, say you genuinely believe in QAnon, you want to save all the children in the world, you're very noble, okay. You also probably love that casserole recipe. You know, you're also probably going to link to your favorite Amazon influencer or someone else. You're not only going to link to QAnon unless you're very, very dedicated. I mean, it's true. Humans are messy, and we don't believe we're messy until we get pointed to it with math and with dense coordinated amplification structures, right? So we use this in order to say, this is an example of our real Python code using the Jacquard Similarity Index of a disinformation site. This is Pro-Trump News. We only looked at their backlinks and their referral domains. So if your target website Who is linking to your target website? That's a referral domain. And how is the backlinks? So one site can backlink 6, 7 times. That's showing that they're giving a big thumbs up in Google search engine, and they're saying, we really like this site, we respect it, we think it's great. If you have platforms like Wikipedia, they're gonna say no follow. They're gonna get blocked out with our code. So we don't look at Reddit, Wikipedia, whatever, the code takes care of it, which was also written by ARL and a student together, so great student research. But we see this is very organized, it's very dense, it's very coordinated, it's beautiful, we love to look at it. This is a disinformation site. We can see here some more examples from our code. That's a neutral site. You can see how messy it is. It's not a cluster. We look at clustering methods in order to figure out our research. So when we think about disinformation and we think about it as this impossible freedom of speech question, I challenge us to think about it from a different angle, and instead to think about what our adversaries have to do differently than what we have to do. If we're marketing the truth, and if we are a free society, everyone can talk, and we're sharing ideas, we're not actively thinking of ways to corrupt a system that's already there, right? So I challenge you to think about what is happening that an adversary needs in order to create a successful disinformation campaign that you don't do. And the research students at the Global Disinformation Lab have been wonderful in sorting through the 200 SEO signals with me to figure out which ones are most compatible with what we want to research, and also is weighted most heavily. So I want to leave you with a quote just to show disinformation isn't new, and it has not just suddenly appeared in 2016. We have George Washington saying, "The truth will ultimately prevail where there is pains to bring it to light." I would like to take this time to thank my student researchers, Lindsay Hodge, Musung Kim, Alexander Lopez, Jujar Singh, and Isabella Sherwood for their time spent with this semester. And we look forward to seeing you all upstairs at the happy hour. And yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your interest in this session. I am really, really excited to be here on behalf of an amazing team of undergraduate, master's, and PhD level student researchers who've been working on this project for over a year. We're Team Evergreen, and we're building the Global Disinformation Policy Database. Today, we've heard from a lot of speakers who have really effectively spoken to the social, political implications of disinformation, misinformation, fake and false news, information operations, influence operations, malinformation, information disorder. Did I miss any? This bundle of concepts that is rather amorphous and that bleeds together and that there is no consensus around the definitions of. And as part of this conversation, we've talked about some of the policy responses and the role of the state. What should the role and what can the role of the state be in addressing this issue? That's what this project's all about. But before I go into a little bit of depth about what our particular approach to addressing this research area is, I want to reacquaint us with the raw materials of our project. What are these policies? What are these government actions that states around the world are taking in connection with this bundle of issues? So here's a not quite random sample, but a little bit of a tour of some policy responses to what the government claims is disinformation, misinformation. So for instance, in 2015, the Cyber Crimes Act of Tanzania, Section 16, for those of you keeping track, criminalizes publishing false information online. In 2022, in China, the regulatory regime governing the technology companies capable of producing so-called deepfakes was enhanced, and the new regulatory regime obligates these companies to maintain rumor control mechanisms. That same year, the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency launched, which has the mission of identifying and responding to specific narratives connected with information operations, but also building capacity across society. So you can see here 3 different countries, 3 different areas of emphasis, 3 different aspects of the problem that they're seeking to address, 3 different normative approaches, 3 different policy mechanisms, 3 different theories of the case. So this is what our project's about. It's about stepping back and considering what is this category of policy action? What are these state responses to disinformation and misinformation? And what can we learn by looking at them specifically? What can we understand once we're able to systematically compare them, if we're able to do that? Can we identify trends? Can we measure various features of this policy? And what can we learn about how governments operationalize and define the concepts that I've talked about already? And I think, yes. So this project is a collaboration between the Global Disinformation Lab and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. We have been working with a fantastic team of 14 master's students for 2 semesters from the LBJ School of Public Affairs. I think many of them are here. You should meet them. They're amazing. And on the GDIL side of things, we've been working with an equally incredible team of volunteer student researchers. And we've been doing this for over a year. And it's really incredible to work with such an amazing team. I think the easiest way to understand exactly what we're doing is by considering our goals and our values. Our goals organize our actions, how exactly we want to represent this information in the world, and our values give us a guidepost for when we run into obstacles of what to do next. So it's actually pretty simple. Seemingly, we're trying to collect all the relevant laws and policies from all around the world that have to do with this issue area. And we want to share this data set and make it accessible to civil society, journalists, and other researchers. And the values that we think that are going to get us there are communication, pragmatism, comprehensiveness, and innovation. And I really hope that you see in the rest of the presentation the students' work balancing the trade-offs of those values and embodying them in all of the things that we do. In order to achieve these goals, we have to overcome 2 fundamental problems, 2 obstacles that we organize our research methodology around. Now, when I say 2 fundamental problems, don't get me wrong, within each of those problems, there is an endless series of trade-offs that have to be made and decisions. How exactly are we going to go about this? But broadly, we consider 2 things. The problem of discovery. How do we find these policies? How do we know which ones are relevant? And the problem of encoding. How do we create a useful data set? From unstructured legislative documents, press releases, executive orders. My team's probably like, you're missing a bunch of them. But they're on websites all across the world. They're in different languages. How do we make them comparable? How do we make them useful to other researchers? So our answer to the first challenge is what we call the comprehensive global scan, which is really, it consists of us developing over 700 search terms per country that we're considering that usually combine a policy term, a term about information or disinformation, and the country name. We developed all of these search terms, and then we passed them to a search automation service. And that search automation service dumps these search results from the first 2 pages or so into a spreadsheet. And we do that for a couple reasons. It enhances consistency. It allows us to be aware of who has seen what result, to make sure that we do our best to see every single result and consider every single result, to scour the internet to make sure that we're aware of all of these policies, all of these legislative actions. It also allows us to do things like deduplicate results, to filter out harmful or clearly irrelevant domains, and to investigate the opportunity of large language models and other AI services to help prioritize which ones we should look at first. And the result of all this activity is that we conducted over 16,000 searches, and we've processed over 156,000 search results. And this is done by a team of 29 volunteer student researchers. And so far, we've discovered around 1,100 potential policies that we are working through to understand whether they are good candidates for our database. So that's the first problem. The second problem is one of encoding. So we address that through a data entry form that follows our qualitative coding scheme that at maximum can be 65 questions, although I don't believe any of our students have run through all 65 or else they would have left. and that generates around 80 variables per policy. And when we were coming up with this qualitative coding scheme, we asked ourselves a couple questions. What are the most important features of these policies? What are the ones that we can actually compare with one another? What are the ones that tell us the most about the problem representations at play in the relevant governments? And what would enable us to answer research questions? We brainstormed a list of over 100 research questions that we thought maybe this data set could help us address. And then finally, what can we collect with the resources available? And we've always had to be extremely attuned to the limitations of our project so that we're not overpromising and we are finishing in a reasonable amount of time. And you see these are on the right. Michael, is it right or left? On the right, are some of the variables that will be encoded in this coding scheme. Things like which technologies are mentioned, which policy instruments, are liabilities created, etc. So these are initial findings. I really want to emphasize that because we are still in the thick of it. But what we've discovered is we have over 140 policies coded according to that coding scheme as of today, but we have over 930 policies remaining in our coding queue. So we have quite a few to work through. And that's what this map indicates above. This is the distribution of the kind of candidate policies that we've identified. The other thing that we've seen, and again, these trends are really only initial because we still have all of these other policies to kind of tear apart and analyze. But the other things that we found are that governments are really not shy about imposing costs in connection with actors who create, enable disinformation and misinformation, or what the state calls disinformation and misinformation. You can see here this graph. The most common category from the data that we've seen so far is our legislative initiatives that impose, that deal in some kind of incentive. And usually that incentive is a negative incentive. They're imposing a cost. The other thing we found is that many relevant policies leave core concepts like disinformation undefined, even when they're creating criminal liabilities. And what we have seen, because one of the things we measure is the definitions that these countries use in these policies when they do use them, is that there's a lot of variance. And the variance may seem inconsequential on a casual reading, but when they're operationalized in law and policies, they can have tremendous effects on societies. So this is what we're seeing so far, and here's what we think it means. I think it's fair to say that this is one of the most dynamic, complex, and contested issue areas of our time. And there's far more at stake than just disinformation. These policies are the vehicles by which all of our fundamental rights are being renegotiated in the age of the information society. I don't think that's an exaggeration to say. There are really some fundamental questions that are being played out through these laws and policies, and they aren't getting the attention they deserve. And finally, a process implication from what we've seen so far is that based on our experiments, human-machine teaming in the form of using large language models to process some of the raw text really has increased the velocity, and we believe changes the economics of creating these policy databases, and expect to hear more from us about that in the future. Speaking of the future, we have a lot of things in progress. This summer, we're hoping to explore an interactive web application where you'll be able to explore the data yourself, make comparisons, filter down to countries and different types of policies, different types of disinformation, misinformation policies. We'll also release the data set, and then in the fall, a second group of LBJ master students will be working on an experiment to identify and code subnational policy through case studies in the United States and India. And then more generally in the coming months, we'll be adding new data features, hopefully working with external collaborators, and experimenting further in large language models, enhancing our work. So that's everything that I have to tell you today. But this was the 10,000-foot view. I'm sure that a lot of that was analytically unsatisfying. Trust me, these students know the details. You should go ask them about it in this happy hour session. They'd love to talk about it. Thank you so much.
As Russell Crowe famously said, "Are you not entertained?" That's exactly what I wanted from you three. Well done. Well done, everyone. We have time, as it turns out, because they were as efficient as we asked them to be. for questions from you all here in the audience before we go upstairs. And so I see hands already. People are leaping out of their seats for questions. We'll do exactly as we've done all day long. Pass the microphone on. I'll sit back down and let you fire away. Andres.
Just a quick question to the last presentation. You said most of the incentives are negative. I'm curious, are there, disincentives then, or punitive? What are examples of the opposite, as in positive? Or if you do this, yay, I'm just curious. Are there examples of that?
That is a fantastic question that I'm sure one of our student researchers probably has a better answer than I do. However, what I would say is, and this is speculative, but I could imagine situations in which countries create policies that incentivize intermediary so platforms to act in a certain way, and mechanisms that could take, tax breaks, access. I hesitate to speculate because it's all somewhere in the data, but I'm sure if my team has seen one of those, they will promptly alert me, and we'll get that information to you. Thank you.
So promotional item, tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, which I know is a very non-student friendly hour of the day, I'm going to host a discussion with Claire Wardle, who now is at Brown University. And Claire, for better or worse, better I think, was a co-author of the Information Disorder Report in 2017 that kind of shaped the way we talk about information, disinformation, malinformation. Spoiler alert. She's rethought that terminology and has a forthcoming article where she's going to come back and say that she thinks it's time to revisit the way we talk about the whole issue of disinformation. And she's agreed to give us an advanced look at her thinking on this at 8 tomorrow morning. So come on along to that session. I think it should be good. And she's a terrific presenter. Okay? End of the advertisement. Thank you. Great presentation, you guys. Really very, very exciting.
The database that you put together, which is great and incredibly useful. I've already sent it to my team to look out for it once it's online fully. I do have a sort of unfair question for you, which is to what extent you kind of take government's word for it that this law or that law is intended to combat disinformation. I mean, there's a lot of good journalists in jail under disinformation laws at this point, so they're kind of not value neutral.
Sure, yeah. We take them fully at their word because, and the trade-off there is, it allows us to measure what the differences are in operationalization. I mean, if we create a database that just reports exactly how the governments themselves characterize the policies, what that does is it enables researchers down the line to pair that with exactly the type of information that you just had in mind, to better understand questions like what really are the differences between democratic approaches to this issue and authoritarian approaches to this issue, and in terms of definition, but also enactment, right? And it's a difficult trade-off because there are all sorts of policies that don't have any of the language we could use to identify them with disinformation or misinformation, and yet we all know, nevertheless, that they are being employed for that purpose. So it's one of the conceptual limitations of our project for sure. We have some ideas about how we might overcome it in a future version, but that is, we're working on getting this one across the finish line. Thank you.
Hi, I just have a quick question. I want to get your thoughts on Project Barn Owl, Liz, about, you were pointing to us, I think, thinking about how we combat this as a free world. And so I'm wondering, to you, Liz, and to the rest of the panel, what do you guys think is the responsibility of tech companies as it comes to this? As you were pointing, Google is not a big fan of figuring out how the back end works, right? But do they have a responsibility as a company to promote, make a value judgment and promote good sites and good information?
Hello. Thank you for the question. It definitely drags me into the dangerous territory of opinions, right? So this is just me. This is not, I guess, the reflection of the project or whatnot. But part of the reason why we look at Project Barn Owl is because it utilizes a system that's already in place for Google. Remember how I was talking about how it's black hat and everything else? In my personal opinion, the United States is going to move pretty slowly on this matter, and I think there might be some people in the room who agree, right? Google already has these policies in place that if you do see coordinated amplification, that they will essentially knock it down. They'll knock it down the SEO and push it down. So Barn Owl works already with established would, once it gets released, would work in place with established policies with Google instead of fighting it. And I think what's really important with that is I continuously hear people talk about content and how do we protect freedom of speech, which is extremely important. But personally, having worked in marketing and having looked at coordinated amplification, really wanting to figure out the math so we can anticipate and not react as we do often in disinformation, I'm always more about studying computational propaganda and how that amplification is actually getting done and how are they manipulating it. Because as I said before, us as individuals, we're going to act very differently than a state campaign that has millions of dollars behind it. So while I don't think that a private company right now is doing enough, some of these companies, I feel like they have very addictive algorithms and they know that it's amplifying it. I think there are ways right now that we need to research to look into the system, starting with what makes us different than millions of dollars computational propaganda campaigns. And there should be signals out there to find that, and that's why I really emphasize SEO and marketing, because it's the bread and butter. Does that answer your question?
Hi, Brian Whitmore, University of Texas Arlington and the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. First of all, congratulations on a great presentation. It was very interesting. I was just wondering, as an avid consumer of a lot of digital forensics projects, what does what you do, how is it similar and how is it different from things like the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Lab or Bellingcat? How is it different in terms of methodology and in terms of output? And how should I look at it alongside those as a consumer of these products? Oh, I guess it would go to any of you, but maybe, Zach seemed to be dealing with this issue the most.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the question. That's something that we deal with a lot because we've had reports in the past where we've run into other projects doing similar work. At the end of the day, our products are intelligence products. They go to NGA, they go to our allies. It is very important to us that they are not saturated with anyone on our team's opinions. It is very much, here's the imagery, here's what our analysis says that imagery shows us, and then you can take from that what you will, you can expand upon that, but it's somewhat more limited down to what you need to know rather than bordering on editorialism as some more journalistic outlets might get. That's kind of what draws the line between Tearline and investigative journalism.
Okay. So for Barn Owl, what I would really like to say is that we try to look at it from a mathematical approach, which I'm really trying to stress to the students that we can do case studies and they are of use, and we can do comparative and they are of use, but let's try to prove the disbelievers wrong and show that we can use math to show that disinformation actually exists and that it can be separated from misinformation. So that's what Barn Owl pushes for, even though we use a heavily content-rich system with SEO. And we have our NLP friends at ARL are wonderful. We went in there and they're like, all right, let's do NLP. And I was like, actually, let's do math, which they also love, of course, too. So yeah, we have a wonderful team who just keeps going back to the fact that we try to do measures, create tools. Instead of to write full content pieces or comparative, we want to let the researcher who has the tool respond and make decisions for themselves.
Well said. I won't add too much because my particular project doesn't deal in, I think, the waters that you were implicating. But I will highlight that for a lab such as ours, it's an interesting position. We want to avoid a situation where we become just another Bellingcat or something. That there are other great actors in that space, and B, the stakes of putting students in a situation where they're doing attribution work is not something we want to be very, 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 very thoughtful about. So we have kind of the privilege to step back and look at structurally, what can we see, what can we learn about how these things manifest, and sometimes that will involve understanding that there are threat actors out there in the world and not shying away from that, but not going out of our way to perhaps with the exception of Chairline, but you have NGA at your back, not going out of our way to do attribution work.
Thanks. Marcos Kounalakis. I'm at the Hoover Institution, and I'd like to ask about the database project. And so you mentioned that you're either doing or going to do subnational research as well to compare. Is that right?
We'll see.
Okay.
Starting next semester, we will be in a similar situation to what we did this past year. We will have, instead of 14 students, we'll have 18 master's students for 2 semesters, plus all of our lovely GDIL student volunteer researchers, if they stick around. Please do. And we're going to experiment initially with doing subnational collection in the United States and India, kind of as an example of big complex democracies that are really, really active in this space, especially at the state level. So hopefully that process will teach us what we need to learn to broaden that out. Although, as I implied earlier, we're seeing some of these new technologies that are coming online that are really effective at amplifying the productivity of individual analysts. So it's hard to predict.
As you do that, if you can look at the coding to make sure that, or to consider how you then would compare those subnational policies to the conflict or contradiction with federal or national policies. It may be already part of your coding, but I think that would be an important part of it.
Absolutely, and if you have any ideas about how particularly to do that, please let us know, because it's a really important issue.
Hi, I'm Aisha Tanzim with Voice of America. I wonder, as you're doing this research and looking at Google and other social media companies that are the conduits for this disinformation, that's what the actors are using. I'm interested in knowing what's their attitude. Do they have any incentive for shooting down such activity, or are they open to it, or does it take a lot of public pressure or maybe, legislation?
I mean, I have an opinion. So the tech companies are very interesting institutions that have really well-meaning, hardworking people whose whole purpose of their teams are to do the kind of detection of disinformation, to work with national partners, to think about the trust and safety aspects of this issue. But the business incentives of these companies doesn't always mean that their work has the biggest impact in the larger organization, from what I've seen and observed. And a lot of those people were recently fired in the large waves of layoffs. So.
I think people smell the happy hour and questions are drying up.
Happy hour waits. Yes. Okay. So it has been a spectacular day, and now we have an event where we can all mingle, enjoy ourselves, sponsored by the Intelligence Studies program here at the University of Texas at Austin, generously putting on a wonderful happy hour for us upstairs. And so I'd like to close the formal part of the day, invite you all upstairs for an informal gathering with all sorts of fun little beverages and noshings, and amazing students to give you a really great, to give you a set of insights into projects that you didn't hear just today, but other projects that we've got going at GDIL. Thanks very much for attending this afternoon session and for the entire day.